Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 168, Cranford House. George Redman built Cranford House in Moama. This home still exists today. George Redman was born in 1830 and he was the son of Samuel and Mary Redman. George was one of 5 children and the second born. 4 of their children survived infancy. His older brother, William Redman, was born in 1830 at Bedfordshire, and in 1851 he was a cordwainer, 21 years old and living with his mother and stepfather. He was a bootmaker, and he lived in Leeds when he married Hester Evans in Leeds in 1853, and they had 6 children. He died in 1914 in Lancashire, aged 84. George's sister, Jane Catherine, was born in 1835 in Bedfordshire. In 1851 she was 17 and was a pupil teacher, living with her mother and stepfather in Leeds. She married David Bailey, a schoolmaster in Dudley, Worcester, in July 1859, and they had 4 children. Jane died in December 1911 in Staffordshire, aged 76. And his other sister, Mary Ann, was born in 1836 in Bedfordshire. Mary Ann was a milliner and aged 15 in the 1851 census, living with her mother and stepfather. She married James Preston Croft Westwood in Leeds on the 12th of August 1854. James was an engineer's agent and they had 1 son, Joseph. Mary Ann died in June 1921 in Yorkshire at the age of 85. George's father, Samuel, died prior to 1844 when he was less than 40 years old, and George's mother went on to marry James Ormond Guy in September 1844. James Guy was an iron moulder. George was convicted in the Bedford Quarter Sessions as a 17-year-old on the 31st of December 1844. His crime is unknown, but he was transported to Port Phillip for a term of 7 years. He wasn't classed as a convict, but an exile, and approximately 500 exiles, who were all ex-juvenile convicts from Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, were transported. George sailed on the Marion on the 27th of September 1847. And there was an article related to this voyage with the ex-juveniles on the 28th of January 1848, titled The Free Ticket System. The Marion, with 297 exiles, has arrived at Hobart, and most likely before these remarks are in print, Port Phillip will have received her allotted number of the draft. We have received some interesting communications in regard to these people, and have only to express a hope that their future conduct will realise the expectations of those who see so favourably from the results of their prison probation. Selected on account of their good behaviour and industrious habits, the free ticket holders from Parkhurst were conducted to the Marion by the governor of the prison alone. No guard, not a single turnkey was necessary, and at a moment when the extension of reformative punishments is a subject of solemn discussion by society of all countries, we sincerely trust that the exiles by the Marion may afford a happy example of the fruits of a merciful and enlightened system. Entrusted in the Marion to the care of Captain McCurley, we cannot but feel assured of an able confirmation of the Parkhurst arrangements while under his charge. Captain McCurley is the son of the veteran keeper of Edinburgh Castle, and is most favourably known for his habits of discipline and his humane and benevolent disposition. Van Diemen's Land and Port Phillip seems to have been exclusively selected as the points of disembarkation for these people. And on the 4th of February 1848, the exiles by the Marion, described in the letters we have received as most useful men, have all obtained employment at Port Phillip at an average wage of £20 per annum. And in the Melbourne Leader, as a recollection in September 1893, it says, "The oldest inhabitant of Echuca I know is Mr. George Redman, erstwhile known as the King of Moama. Mr. Redman is a native of Bedford, aged 62. He landed in Port Phillip in 1846 and lived in St Kilda for a few months in a wattle and dab and weatherboard house, one of the best residences in the place then. In 1847, Mr. Redman was engaged to go up to Barham Station on the north side of the Murray. He came up from Melbourne with a bullock team through Kilmore and McIver and crossed the river at Isaac's Punt, where Echuca Park now is. Echuca was then a portion of the Warparilla Run. And another recollection on the 26th of October 2001. It says Redman's on High at 499 High Street, Echuca, which was recently sold, was built in 1862 by George Redman and named Redman's Commercial Hotel. It's had many roles since, including a boarding house and a series of small business operations. The original building is used today by a number of businesses, including the Redman's on High restaurant and bar. The current owners are reconditioning the building to create a school camp complex to accommodate 50 students and their teachers. Federal government funding will help restore roofing, the facade, repair veranda flooring, and paint the exterior. Internal repairs will focus on painting and repairing walls and floors. And I'll add a photo of the building, which now in 2025 still has a number of businesses running within it. However, on the 21st of March 1863, it was George Redman's Commercial Hotel, and he advertised saying that it was good accommodation for travellers. Wool, hides, skins and tallow wanted for cash. Apply to George Redman, Redman's Commercial Hotel, Echuca. 4 years later, in reference to the floods that hit Echuca, the water has completely surrounded the commercial hotel, but Redman has stuck to it manfully and has been doing a better business in consequence of the rise than he'd been doing for some time, people having a fancy to row across the street to aid our low matters, and he is faring with a jolly business. And it says when the flood was at its height, the depth of water in the passage of Redman's Commercial Hotel was 19 inches. In 1846, James Maiden, the founder of Moama, built the Junction Inn, and on the 5th of September 1868, so only a year after he had the commercial hotel in Echuca, he took over the Junction Inn at Moama. And the Junction Inn was near Maiden's Punt, and it provided accommodation, liquor and stabling for those waiting to cross the river. It was a simple wooden inn on high ground in Chanter Street, and it welcomed travellers and settlers alike to share a drink and a meal together. And the remains of the Junction Inn are located at the site, and there is signage up for travellers to see. George Dorwood from episode 98 took over the Junction Inn by May 1870. Echuca received another flood in July 1870, and it says the Murray at Echuca is now at 29 feet and 10 inches above the summer level and 3 feet and 3.5 inches above the flood of 1867. At the back of Redman's Commercial Hotel stables, the water has been pouring in over the bank for the last 3 days. And 3 months later, late last evening, we learned by telegram that the water in the Campaspe, already very high and over the flats, was rising with alarming rapidity. Redman's Commercial Hotel was entirely flooded. It had reached the sills of the windows. So it seems that he's running, at this point, 2 hotels, one on either side of the river. On the 27th of July 1870, there was a letter in the paper from George Redman, the Malmesbury Reservoir. Sir, as one of those who have suffered from the recent action taken by the government in heedlessly letting the water escape in such a reckless manner from the Malmesbury Reservoir, I would ask, is there no redress? Are we to sit quietly down and see ourselves ruined through the culpable negligence of the powers that be? I, for one, will do no such thing, but will try what virtue there is in little legal advice. The sudden rise in the Campaspe could be caused by nothing but the water let out of the reservoir. I have lived here for a number of years and have seen the heaviest floods, but have never known the Campaspe to rise or fall so quickly as in this instance, more particularly when you take the height of the Murray into consideration. Such being the case, I consider we are morally entitled, if not legally, to compensation, and if the government will not recompense us for being sustained, they ought to at least see everything done to prevent a recurrence of a like catastrophe. Yours truly, G. Redman, Commercial Hotel, Echuca. And it was this time that it was mentioned in local papers of George building and owning Cranford House. And it says that George had the largest and best kept orchard in the neighbourhood of Moama. And it says that George Redman was a well-known auctioneer of Moama at the time that it was built. The original block consisted of 50 acres, which were purchased by the Crown in 1871 by the present proprietor, Mr. Redman. The area has been subdivided into several paddocks, each of which is cultivated with some cereal or other adapted to requirements of the market. About 10 acres reserved for the homestead and orchard occupy rising ground in the centre, and overlooking all the rest of the block, the dwelling house, a commodious brick edifice, and outhouses being built at the foot facing the southwest. Near this spot are some hundreds of Murray pines springing up from seeds self-sown from some of the older trees which grow here and there. In fact, so thick is this young forest that Mr. Redman is compelled to thin them out pretty extensively. 3 years later, there was an article in February. It's titled "The Garden, Cranford Vineyard, Moama," by our travelling reporter. On continuing my visits, amongst other places worthy of mention, I found the new grounds belonging to Mr. Redman, situated at Moama, New South Wales, consisting of some 27 acres of excellent land, securely fenced, 10 acres of which are planted with vines and young fruit trees, the whole of which are succeeding amazingly. Oranges and lemons are also receiving attention. The soil is a rich, red, light sand, easily worked and of considerable depth, and the subsoil being also rich and warm, therefore both vines and fruit trees thrive wonderfully. The proprietor resides in Echuca, and as strange as it may appear, although only a nice drive from his residence over the river Murray to his Cranford grounds, he cannot, since the termination of the border treaty, bring over even a buggy of melons or pumpkins for his own use without paying duty, while the removal of even legally of wine entails an expense of 4 shillings for duty. Therefore, it becomes incumbent upon those Victorians having estates upon the New South Wales side to eat their fruit and drink their wine where it is grown or produced. Much credit is due to Mr. Redman for the plucky manner in which he has gone in planting, Cranford being highly creditable to him. And on the 26th of September 1874, it says Redman's Commercial Hotel, William Martin has applied for and obtained a licence for the house known as Redman's Commercial Hotel in High Street. And it says that Mr. George Redman of Moama reports having sold at satisfactory prices the commercial hotel in High Street and several allotments of land in Moama. On the 22nd of August 1878, new magistrates for New South Wales. The list of newly appointed magistrates have been published today and include George Redman of Moama. On the 20th of July 1881, Mr. Shackle will sell stock at Redman's Yards in Moama. So it sounds like he also had yards for selling stock and other goods over that side of the river. And on the 7th of September 1881, it says to let Redman's Bridge Hotel in Moama. Apply to Mrs. O'Sullivan on the premises or George Redman, auctioneer of Moama. On the 15th of December 1888, George Redman, JP Moama, has been appointed Acting Inspector of Sheep. And on the 29th of March 1890, death of an old resident. Great regret was expressed on Wednesday morning last by a large number of inhabitants of Echuca and Moama when it became known that Mrs. Anne Redman, wife of George Redman, had died during the night at her residence at Moama. Mrs. Redman had been ailing for some years back from rheumatics and had only recently returned from a sojourn at the seaside near Melbourne. The deceased lady, who was a resident of Echuca and Moama for upwards of 35 years, was very much respected for her many amiable qualities by a large circle of friends here and in Melbourne. And the death notice stated that she did die at Cranford House in Moama, and she was a sister to Mrs. Francis of Moama, and she was 69. George and Anne had no children. Another report in the paper, Mrs. Redman, wife of Mr. G. Redman of Moama, died very suddenly at her residence. The deceased was an old resident of the district and very highly respected by a large circle of friends. The funeral took place on Thursday when an unusually large cortege, including all of the leading residents of both towns, followed the deceased lady's remains to the Moama cemetery. George placed memorials for his wife in the following few years after her death, and one 12 months after her death. Says, in remembrance of my dear beloved wife, Anne Redman, who departed this life at Cranford House, Moama, New South Wales, on the 25th of March, 1890, gone but not forgotten. On the 19th of December, 1891, there was an announcement of a marriage of a Miss Nimmo, who was the niece of Mr. G. Redman of Moama, who married a Mr. Martin of Melbourne. This niece was Maria Frances Nimmo, Anne's sister's child. George Redman died on the 31st of July 1902 in Moama, and in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times in February 1903, it had a report on a farmhouse being destroyed. It said early on Tuesday morning a fire broke out in a 7-roomed wooden house erected upon a farm about 4 miles from Moama. The property was lately purchased by Michael Kickham from the estate of the late Mr. George Redman, and the premises was unoccupied at the time of the fire. The house was totally destroyed, And the old Bridge Hotel in Moama that was mentioned earlier was built by George Redman in 1876, and it was destroyed in a fire in 1907. It seems from George's will that he had at least half a dozen titles of land in Echuca, Warparilla and the Kerrang districts, as well as over in Moama, and this was highlighted on the 29th of November 1902, so a few months after his death. Great sale of town and suburban properties. 5th of December 1902 at Barry's Bridge Hotel, Moama. Mackenzie & Co. in conjunction with Chanter, Martin & Co. are favoured with instructions from the executors of the late George Redman Esquire to sell by public auction in Moama the following. The Moama properties. Number 1, the well-known Bridge Hotel, now in occupation of Mr. John Barry, having one of the best business connections in the district. 2, a 7-roomed brick house leased for a number of years by the Bank of New South Wales. 3, an 8-roomed house, 6 of which are brick, together with about 40 acres of land, known as Cranford House, formerly Mr. Redman's private residence. Number 4, a paddock of 73 acres known as Pine Farm, on which is erected a good 5-room dwelling situated 1.5 miles from Moama. 5, a paddock of 10 acres well fenced immediately opposite Cranford House, also a 4-acre paddock fronting Menina Street. And 6, 32 building allotments in various parts of the town of Moama, some of them in the very best and central positions. And his Echuca properties. Firstly, a good cottage now in the occupation of Mrs. Stokes. A vacant block of land adjoining will be sold with this property. The second one, a paddock of 18 acres at the junction of the Bendigo and Tatura railway lines. And the next one, several building allotments in High Street, Hare Street and Nish Street. The testators for his will were Hugh Mackenzie of Echuca, who was a stock and station agent, and his niece's husband, Charles Thomas Martin, who was listed as a law clerk of Moonee Ponds. In his will, he bestowed his brothers and sisters £100 each, and he stated that if any of them were deceased, then it was to be shared amongst those remaining siblings. All of his personal and real estate he bestowed to his niece, Maria Frances Martin. He gave his servant, Annie Holmes, £25 and 2 allotments of land in Moama that included a cottage. His New South Wales real estate was left to his nieces and nephews, which included Maria on trust for when they attained the age of 21, or for his nieces if they married before 21. So a little more on his niece, Maria. Maria Frances Nimmo was born in Echuca Village in 1863. She was the daughter of Thomas Nimmo and Sarah Frances. Sarah Frances and Anne Redman were sisters. They'd been born in Cranford, Middlesex, England, so no doubt this is why the home was called Cranford House. Sarah came to Victoria in 1858. In 1861, Sarah lived with George and Anne until she married Thomas Nimmo. The marriage took place in Bendigo, and it stated that on the 1st of July at the All Saints Church, Thomas Nimmo, third son of the late James Nimmo Esquire of Sight Hill, Corstorphine, Edinburgh, to Sarah G. Frances, youngest daughter of the late John Francis Esquire of Cranford Bridge, Middlesex, England. Not long after their marriage, they both went to Echuca to live with George and Anne, but Anne complained of Thomas being lazy and lacking in willingness to work. Thomas then talked Sarah into going to Queensland, but did not get as far as Melbourne when he left her for 7 days, going on a drinking bend. Sarah returned to her sister. Thomas Nimmo then returned to Echuca, and George Redman set him up as a butcher in Echuca. However, this only lasted 2 months, as he was regularly intoxicated and was using violent and threatening language towards Sarah. In August 1863, she was nursing their daughter when he struck her, and she fled to Anne's house and did not return to him. Thomas Nimmo fled to Queensland for 6 months, but he again returned, and George Redman again tried to assist him by gaining employment for him on the Goulburn River and giving him money and clothes. All was well for 2 months, but then Thomas came intoxicated to the home in Moama, threatening to poison himself and to kill their child. George Redman then tried to pay him off to keep him away, and he did so successfully for 18 months. In December 1865, Sarah had stated in a court case not related to her husband that she was living at the commercial Hotel Echuca with her sister, Mrs. Redman. In 1866, Thomas Nimmo again returned, but this time he was lodging with a known prostitute named Mrs. Jackson in Echuca and was committing adultery. Thomas left to go back to Queensland and took Mrs. Jackson with him, and in 1872 were presumed still there and living together. Sarah and Thomas Nimmo divorced in 1872, and the detail on the case was presented in the papers. On the 20th of September 1872, Nimmo versus Nimmo. A petition by Sarah Nimmo praying for a divorce from her husband Thomas Nimmo on the grounds of adultery, cruelty and desertion. There was no appearance for the respondent. The petitioner is 32 and the respondent 35. The parties were married at Sandhurst in 1862. There had been one child now living. Soon after the marriage, the respondent commenced to indulge in drinking. The petitioner alleged that the respondent gave little towards her in support during the time they were married. He left her several times and did not return for long intervals, and finally left her in 1866 and committed adultery with a woman who at one time lived at Echuca. The court reserved its decision and was adjourned to the next day. So the follow-up article on the judgment. In the Supreme Court on Saturday, the petition by Sarah Nimmo for the dissolution of her marriage with her husband was heard and the court gave judgment. The Chief Justice said the dissolution of marriage was sought for on the grounds of adultery and desertion. There was no doubt about the adultery, but the question was whether the desertion was proved. He separated from her and remained away for 3 years. During this time, he sent her a large sum of £250, which he had obtained by some means or another. So far, he did not wish to desert her or withdraw from her. She, however, declined to live with him unless he prepared a home for her. The court thought that although he was willing to support her, a wife was entitled to something more than mere support. She was entitled to the society of her husband, and the support must be as such as would enable them to live together. His withdrawing himself from her in this way amounted to the desertion contemplated by the Act, and the court would pronounce a decree for dissolution of the marriage. 4 years after the divorce, Thomas Nimmo married Sarah Dar Allen Willis, and they featured in the Maxfield Court of Petty Sessions on the 3rd of March 1911. A prohibition order was issued against publicans and others supplying Thomas Nimmo and Sarah Dar Nimmo with intoxicating liquor. So they obviously both had an issue with liquor, and as a result, Thomas Nimmo died in 1913. So as mentioned before, Maria married Charles Thomas Martin in December 1891 at St James's Church of England in Moama. Charles Thomas was the third son of the late Septimus Martin of Melbourne, and Maria was commonly known as Fanny to the family, and that's how she's listed in this record. Fanny Nimmo, niece of George Redman, Esquire of Cranford, Moama. Charles Martin was 2 years older than Maria, and he was born in Richmond. His father, Septimus, was an Englishman, and his mother was Alice McKillop Smith. His parents married in Melbourne in 1853, and Charles was the fourth of 9 children. His father was a magistrate and was described upon his death as a very old colonist. His father died 6 years before he married Maria. However, his mother, Alice, lived until 1910. She died at her home in South Yarra, aged 74, and it's said that she'd been a resident of Melbourne since 1836. In 1888, there was another marriage announcement in the paper stating that William, the eldest son of the late Septimus Martin, married Margaret MacArthur, who was the only daughter of Neil MacArthur of Echuca, and that was the William Martin that purchased the hotel off George Redman. Maria and Charles Martin had a child in Carlton North in 1895, but that child lived only 1 day. They lived in a home they called Fairlawn in Moonee Ponds, and they also had a home in Toorak Road, South Yarra, that they named Cranford. Maria died in 1906, aged only 43, in East Melbourne. By 1936, Charles Thomas Martin was the manager of the Equity Trustees and Executors and Agency Company Limited. And there was a mention in an article about Harry Bellingham Howard Smith, the ship owner, whose £1,135,378 will was lodged for probate. Well, Charles Thomas Martin was part of the management of that estate, and he was left £1,000. And if you'd like to know more about the Howard Smiths, I'll be releasing an episode soon. It'll be episode 170 on this family. Charles Martin died on the 11th of February 1938, and upon his death there was an obituary that states that Mr. Charles Thomas Martin, formerly manager in Melbourne of the Equity Trustees Company Limited, and one of the leading members of the Masonic Order in Victoria, died yesterday at his home in Toorak Road, South Yarra. Mr. Mutton retired from the position of manager of the company in December after 35 years' association with the company. He joined it as an assistant manager and was appointed manager in 1933. Until his retirement, Mr. Mutton was a member of the Melbourne Rotary Club and the Melbourne Cricket Club. In the Masonic Order, he held several high offices at the time of his death, including those of past Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Victoria and past Deputy Grand Master in the Grand Mark Lodge of Victoria. He was also first Grand Principal of the Supreme Grand Chapter of Victoria, the Right Worthy District Grand Supreme Ruler in the degree of Secret Monitor. Mr. Mutton had attained to the 32nd degree of the ancient and accepted right of Scotland. And the funeral of Charles Mutton? Between 1,400 and 1,500 friends, drawn from all sections of the business and commercial world, and the Masonic Lodge were among the mourners at the funeral of the late Mr. Charles Thomas Martin of Cranford, Toorak Road, South Yarra, and manager of the Equity Trustees, Executors and Agency Company Limited, which was held at the Melbourne General Cemetery, Carlton, yesterday afternoon. The service was held at St Albans Church in Armidale, where the addresses were heard through amplifiers. The chief mourner was Mr. R. Smith Martin, a brother of the deceased. And in the will of Mr. Charles Thomas Martin of Cranford, Toorak Road, South Yarra, manager, who died on the 11th of February, was lodged in May of 1938, and by his will that was dated on the 24th of November 1937, Mr. Martin left the residue of his estate, which consisted of real estate valued at £5,786 and personal property valued at £19,586, to be divided equally amongst his nephews and nieces. He made provision for his sister and directed that after her death the following legacies should be paid: Vestry of Christ Church of England, South Yarra, £25, the Lord Mayor's Fund, Melbourne, £50, Masonic Homes of Victoria, £25, Freemasons Hospital, East Melbourne, £50. He made certain gifts to his brothers and directed that his Masonic jewels and regalia should be given to the Freemasons' homes in Punt Road, Prahran. So who else lived at Cranford House after George Redman's death? Well, on the 30th of June 1906, it stated in the Echuca newspaper Property Sales, and it says Mr. John Clark of Cranford, Moama, being the purchaser. However, 5 years later, there was sale of furniture by Mackenzie and Company. It says that they will conduct a sale of household furniture and effects, including a buggy and a chaff cutter, at Cranford, Moama, under the instructions of Mr. John Clark. And an auction will be held at the Mackenzie and Company Echuca Yards for the splendidly situated and valuable property known as Cranford in Moama, with 38.5 acres of excellent land on behalf of John Clark. 3 years later, tenders were invited for brick additions at Cranford, Moama by Mr. W.J. Nicholas. On the 31st of May 1917, it says Insurance Company thanked. In today's issue, Mr. W.J. Nicholas thanked the Victoria Insurance Company, of which Mr. H. Kierans is the district agent, for prompt and satisfactory settlement of his claim in connection with the recent fire at his residence at Cranford, Moama. The Echuca Fire Brigade is also thanked for its valuable assistance. And the Nicholas family are still there living 5 years later, as there is a death notice of Thomas John Nicholas, known as Jack, on the 25th of June, and the loved son of W.J. and Sophie Nicholas of Cranford, Moama. A little less than a year later, there's a death notice in the paper, and it says on the 4th of May at Cranford, Moama, Jane Joachim, relict of the late William Joachim of Worley, New South Wales, aged 89 years and 10 months. And then 5 years later, Mrs. Nicholas, aged 66 years, wife of W.J. Nicholas of Cranford, Moama, has died. In January 1954, there was a death notice for Mabel Eliza Joachim, and it says on the 1st of January she died at Cranford, Moama, and she was the youngest daughter of the late William and Jane Joachim of Worley. I have passed this beautiful home many times. I often wondered who owned the home. You can tell it's a very old home and that it would have had a lot of land around it before the big developments that we have surrounding it today. Today it now has quite a high fence around it, but you can tell just by the roof line what a beautiful home it is, and it's been restored wonderfully, and there's actually been a small estate with 2-storey villas that have been built around home. So if you're ever driving into Moama from Deniliquin and Mathara direction, you'll see the large water tank that has been beautifully painted recently, the pines and the sandhill. And just after that is Cranford House that's sitting just by the side of the highway. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.